our story begins not with a person, but with an ideal, a vision crafted by the harsh realities and spiritual fervor of the Middle Ages. To understand the medieval standard of beauty, one must first forget the sun-kissed, vibrant health we often idolize today. The medieval world was one of scarcity, where the shadow of hunger, disease, and constant physical toil lay over the lives of all but a very privileged few. In such a world, beauty became a reflection of everything that was rare, desirable, and divinely ordained. It was a code written not in makeup tutorials or fashion magazines, but in prayer books, courtly poetry, and the very structure of society itself. At the very pinnacle of this code was a quality so prized, so unattainable for the vast majority, that it became the ultimate status symbol: pallor. A pale alabaster complexion was the non-negotiable foundation of medieval beauty for both women and men of the upper classes. This was not the pale of illness, but the radiant, translucent white of a person who never had to toil under the sun. Tanned, weathered skin was the mark of a peasant, a laborer, a serf bound to the land. It spoke of a life of grueling outdoor work, of poverty, and of a lowly station. In stark contrast, the pallor of a noble woman or a courtly gentleman was a living advertisement of their wealth and leisure. It proved they lived a life sheltered from manual labor, their skin untouched by the sun's coarsening rays, preserved like fine parchment. This ideal was so powerful that it spawned an entire industry of early cosmetics and skincare. A quiet, desperate alchemy practiced in castle chambers and monastic laboratories. Women and some men sought any means to achieve this coveted whiteness. They would wash their faces with ass's milk, a practice whispered to have been beloved by the legendary Poppaea Sabina, wife of Emperor Nero, though our medieval ancestors would have known of it only through fragmented classical texts. More commonly, they used concoctions of breadcrumbs soaked in milk, or masks of powdered beans and rice. But the most dramatic and most dangerous method was the application of ceruse, a paste made from white lead and vinegar. This substance, we now know with the grim certainty of hindsight, was a slow, insidious poison. It could cause hair loss, skin scarring, muscle paralysis, and even death with prolonged use. Yet the desire for that flawless, ghostly white facade was so intense that generations willingly painted this toxin onto their skin, a testament to the immense pressure to conform to an ideal, a pressure that transcends centuries. As we embark on this new journey together, your support would mean the world to me. If the sound of my voice brings you comfort, please do give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. It truly helps this little community grow. And as you settle into your pillows, I would love to feel connected to you all. Perhaps in the comments tomorrow, you could tell me what country you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's a wonderful thought, isn't it? A scattered family drifting off to sleep together, connected by stories from long, long ago. And this pale canvas was not meant to be entirely featureless. Upon it, the most delicate of colors were to be painted, creating a striking, almost doll-like contrast. The cheeks and lips were to be touched with a soft, rosy blush, a hint of life blooming from within the snowy complexion. This was achieved with natural, and thankfully safer, remedies. Crushed geranium or hibiscus petals could be mixed with grease to create a rudimentary lip balm or cheek stain. The juice of raspberries or strawberries was also used, though its fleeting color required constant reapplication. For those of greater means, a substance called economies, derived from the bodies of a specific insect, provided a richer, more lasting red. This tiny insect, harvested from the economies oak trees of the Mediterranean, was so valuable it became a form of currency and a symbol of luxury. Its crimson stain, a distant forerunner to the cochineal and carmine dyes we know today. But the pursuit of the medieval ideal of beauty extended far beyond the skin. It was a holistic concept, one that sought to create a human form that reflected the divine order of the universe, a form that was, above all, symmetrical, proportionate, and graceful in its every movement. The body itself was a text to be read, and its features told a story of lineage, health, and moral virtue. For a woman, the true centerpiece of her beauty was not just her face, but her hair. Long, flowing, lustrous hair was an object of near obsession, celebrated in countless songs and romances. It was the crown of a woman's allure, its length and sheen a direct indicator of her health and vitality. Blonde hair, the color of gold and sunlight, was considered the absolute pinnacle of desirability, a rare and captivating trait often associated with the Virgin Mary and celestial beings in religious art. To achieve this coveted shade, women would employ various methods to lighten their tresses. They would sit for hours in the sun, their hair spread out over a wide-brimmed hat called a hennin that had its crown cut out, allowing the sun to bleach only the hair while protecting the precious pale face. They also used hair washes made with saffron, lemon juice, or even urine to accelerate the lightening process, a practice that, while effective, certainly would have tested the limits of courtly fragrance. The ideal form of the medieval woman was one of elegant slenderness, but with a softness, a gentle curvature that suggested both maidenly purity and the potential for motherhood. A high, smooth forehead was considered a mark of intelligence and noble bearing. So much so that women would often pluck their hairlines back to create the illusion of a higher, more domed brow. The eyes were to be large, bright, and clear, their color less important than their expression, which should be demure and downcast, reflecting a modest and pious nature. The nose was to be long and straight, the mouth small, with a rosebud shape, and the chin delicate. The neck, celebrated in poetry, was to be long and swan-like, rising gracefully from the shoulders. This was a beauty of delicate lines and restrained elegance, a body kept hidden and protected by layers of fabric, its contours suggested rather than revealed, making the glimpses of pale skin at the throat or wrist all the more potent and alluring. For men, the standards of beauty were a complex interplay of chivalric virtue, martial prowess, and refined courtly manners. The ideal knight, the hero of the romances, was a paradox embodied in flesh. He was expected to possess the raw, physical strength of a warrior, yet the gentle grace of a courtier. His body, therefore, had to reflect this duality. He was to be tall and broad-shouldered, with a powerful chest and strong, muscular limbs, capable of wearing heavy armor for hours on end, and wielding a broadsword with deadly precision. These were the attributes of the fighter, the protector, the champion in tournaments and on the battlefield. His hands, while strong, were also expected to be elegant, capable of holding a lady's favor with tenderness or strumming a lute with skill. His face was to be lean and angular, with a strong, determined jawline and a straight nose that hinted at noble ancestry. A well-groomed beard was often seen as a sign of maturity and wisdom, though fashions fluctuated between clean-shaven faces, as popularized by the Normans, and the short, forked beards of the later Gothic period. But the medieval man's beauty was not solely in his physique. It was profoundly linked to his character, a concept known as largesse, or generosity. A nobleman was expected to be lavish with his wealth, hosting great feasts, giving rich gifts, and supporting artists and poets. This generosity of spirit was believed to shine through his countenance, making him truly beautiful in the eyes of his peers and subordinates. His speech was to be measured and courteous, his manners impeccable. He was to be skilled in the art of conversation, able to discuss poetry, philosophy, and the rules of courtly love. The ultimate expression of this refined masculinity was found in the concept of courtly love, where a knight would dedicate his heroic deeds to a noble lady, often one he could never rightfully possess, like the wife of his lord. This love was meant to be a source of spiritual and moral improvement, inspiring him to ever greater acts of valor and courtesy. In this context, his physical beauty was the vessel for his inner virtue, the two inextricably linked in the pursuit of an almost divine perfection. This intricate tapestry of physical ideals and moral codes created a standard that was as demanding as it was aspirational, a beacon guiding the behavior and self-perception of the medieval aristocracy, a world where every glance, every gesture was part of a silent, continuous performance of beauty and status. And as we consider these faces from the past, these men and women striving for an impossible ideal, our story must now turn from the ethereal realm of features and forms to the much more tangible and often pungent world they inhabited. For the pursuit of beauty does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the environment, by the tools available, and by the very practical limitations of daily life. The medieval world was one without modern plumbing, without the concept of daily bathing as we know it, and without the scientific understanding of hygiene. This created a fascinating, and to our modern sensibilities, perhaps startling, contrast between the aspiration for a radiant, divine beauty and the gritty, earthy reality of the human body. The next layer of our exploration, therefore, must descend from the high towers of courtly ideals into the bustling, muddy streets, the smoky great halls, and the private chambers where the daily rituals of the body were performed, rituals that were as much about social necessity as they were about aesthetics. A world where the scent of rosewater fought a constant and often losing battle against the persistent odors of life itself. The air in a medieval castle or a bustling town was a thick tapestry of smells, a constant and unavoidable presence. It was the sharp, acrid smoke from hearths burning peat or wood, the sweet, dusty scent of hay and rushes covering the floor, the pungent aroma of tallow candles made from animal fat, and the underlying, pervasive musk of humanity and animals living in close quarters. In this olfactory landscape, the concept of personal fragrance was not merely a luxury. It was a vital tool for navigating the world. The ideal of the pale, ethereal beauty, so clean and pure in artistic depictions, existed in stark contrast to this reality, and the methods of achieving a state of perceived cleanliness were deeply pragmatic, often rooted in necessity rather than vanity. Bathing, a practice enjoyed in Roman antiquity with their vast aqueducts and public baths, had become a complex and sometimes suspect activity in the medieval mind. The church, while not entirely forbidding cleanliness, often preached that excessive attention to the body could lead to the sin of vanity and a neglect of the soul. Some ascetic religious orders wore hair shirts and avoided bathing as a form of penance, seeing bodily filth as a way to conquer worldly desires. Furthermore, the practical difficulties of bathing were immense. Heated water required hauling heavy cauldrons, heating them over a fire, and filling a large, often wooden tub, a labor-intensive process usually reserved for the wealthy and performed infrequently. A full immersion bath was a rare event, sometimes undertaken only a few times a year, often preceded by a bloodletting, which was thought to make the body more susceptible to chills. Yet, people were not content to simply remain dirty. The daily routine of hygiene for most, from the noble to the commoner, involved what we might now call spot cleaning. Upon waking, a person would typically wash their face, hands, and sometimes their feet with water from a basin. The wealthy might use scented soaps, often imported from Spain or Italy, where soap making with olive oil created a finer, milder product than the harsh, animal fat-based soaps common in Northern Europe. Tooth care was managed with cloths rubbed on the teeth, sometimes dipped in abrasive powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or herbs like mint and sage to freshen the breath. Chewing on fennel seeds or aniseed was also a common practice for this purpose. But where water failed, fragrance triumphed. This is where the pursuit of beauty intertwined with the practical need to mask odor. The use of perfumes, herbs, and flowers was widespread and sophisticated. Lavender, rose, and violet were prized for their pleasant scents. Ladies would often tuck sachets of dried herbs, known as sweet bags, into their clothing and between the layers of linen in their storage chests to impart a fresh aroma. Garments were rubbed with dried rose petals and lavender to combat the smell of smoke and sweat. Wealthy households strewed their floors with fresh rushes mixed with fragrant herbs like meadowsweet and chamomile, which would release their scent when walked upon. A natural form of air freshener. The hands, constantly in view during meals and social interactions, received particular attention. After washing, they might be rubbed with rosewater. Elaborate etiquette governed the use of fingers at the table, and scented finger bowls filled with rosewater or infused with rosemary were presented between courses. This attention to the most visible parts of the body, the face and hands, created a kind of presentation cleanliness, a curated freshness for public life that belied the less frequently washed body beneath the layers of clothing. This reliance on fragrance over washing extended to the hair. Washing long, thick hair was an arduous task, given the lack of efficient shampoos and the time it took to dry without modern hairdryers in often drafty, cold dwellings. Instead, women would comb their hair meticulously, sometimes sprinkling it with scented powders made from orris root or dried lavender to absorb oils and impart a pleasant smell. They would then braid it and confine it under veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses, which served the dual purpose of modesty and keeping the hair clean and manageable. The headdress itself, therefore, became a crucial component of beauty and hygiene. A beautiful, structured frame for the face that hid the practical challenges of hair maintenance. This constant, creative battle against grime and odor reveals a profound truth about the medieval relationship with the body. It was not a body to be showcased in its natural state, but a vessel to be managed, adorned, and presented according to a strict social and spiritual code. The layers of clothing, the veils, the perfumes, and the pallid makeup all acted as a barrier between the raw, earthly reality of human existence and the idealized, almost divine image one was expected to project. The body was a source of temptation and sin, yet it was also a temple of the Holy Spirit. This duality created a beauty standard that was, at its core, about transformation. It was about using the materials at hand: lead, herbs, flowers, fabric, and fragrance, to transcend the limitations of the flesh and aspire to a higher, more perfect state of being. A state that reflected the order of God's universe and the rigid hierarchy of the society He had ordained. And as we move from the general atmosphere of life to the specific, tangible objects of adornment, we find that this transformation was most eloquently expressed not on the skin itself, but in the glittering jewels, rich fabrics, and symbolic colors that a person wore. A silent language of power, piety, and identity spoken by the entire body. If the body was a canvas, then clothing and adornment were the vibrant pigments and precious gold leaf used to illustrate one's place in the divine and social order. In a society where literacy was the domain of the few, clothing was a public, legible text. The fabric, the color, the cut, and the jewelry a person wore spoke volumes about their wealth, their lineage, their profession, and even their moral character. The pursuit of beauty was, therefore, inextricably linked to the display of status. And the sumptuary laws passed repeatedly throughout the period stand as a frantic legal testimony to just how powerful this sartorial language had become. These laws, dictated by the crown or local governments, meticulously regulated who could wear what, desperate to maintain the visible barriers between the nobility, the merchant class, and the peasantry. For the nobility, fabric was the first and most important signifier. Silk, velvet, and finely woven Flemish wool were the equivalents of today's most exclusive designer labels. Silk, in particular, was the ultimate luxury, shimmering and smooth against the skin, often imported at great cost from the East, along treacherous trade routes. Its very presence in a gown or tunic was a statement of immense wealth and global connections. Velvet, with its dense, plush pile, was another fabric of prestige, its weight and depth of color absorbing and playing with light in a way that simpler clothes could not. The colors themselves were a language. The brightest, most enduring dyes were derived from rare and expensive sources. Deep crimson came from the kermes insect, a rich purple from the murex snail, and a vibrant blue from ultramarine, made from powdered lapis lazuli, mined almost exclusively in Afghanistan. To wear a gown of crimson silk velvet was to wear a fortune. To literally drape oneself in the labors of countless traders, artisans, and miners from across the known world. This was beauty as power, a visual domination of one's surroundings. The cut of the garments evolved dramatically over the centuries, each new style reflecting shifting attitudes towards the body itself. In the early High Middle Ages, clothing for both sexes was relatively loose and flowing, emphasizing a vertical, column-like silhouette that echoed the rising lines of Romanesque architecture. It concealed the body's form, suggesting modesty and a focus on the spiritual. But as the Gothic era dawned, so too did a new aesthetic. Clothing began to follow the lines of the body, revealing and accentuating its shape in a way that was both daring and meticulously contrived. For men, the long, flowing tunics were gradually replaced by shorter jackets that showed off the legs, and hose that fitted like a second skin, leaving little to the imagination. The codpiece, initially a practical piece of fabric laced over the opening of the hose, evolved into a prominent, often padded and embellished, symbol of masculinity and virility. For women, the transformation was even more profound. The simple, loose gown gave way to the cotehardie, a tightly fitted garment that laced or buttoned down the front or back, stretching from the shoulders to the hips, explicitly outlining the bust, waist, and torso. Over this, women of means wore a surcoat, often with dramatically open sides, or with armholes cut so low they revealed the fitted cotehardie beneath. The most iconic and controversial garment of the later medieval period was the houppelande, a voluminous gown for both sexes, but for men especially, that was characterized by its enormous sleeves, sometimes so long they trailed on the ground, and its high, standing collar. The houppelande was a garment of pure ostentation, using vast quantities of the most expensive fabric to create a sculptural, almost architectural form. It was beauty not of the body, but of the artifice that surrounded it, and upon these walking displays of wealth, jewelry glittered and gleamed, each piece heavy with meaning. While we might associate jewelry purely with adornment, in the medieval world, its primary function was often talismanic or symbolic. Rings, brooches, pendants, and belts were not just pretty, they were portable security, statements of faith, and pledges of loyalty. A jewel-encrusted belt, hanging low on the hips, was a central focus of both male and female attire, its precious metal and stones highlighting the waist, and by implication, the loins. Rings were worn in abundance, not just on fingers, but sometimes sewn onto the fabric of garments. They signified everything from betrothal and marriage to membership in a guild or a knightly order. Reliquary pendants, which contained tiny fragments of a saint's bone, a piece of the true cross, or a shred of a holy garment, were perhaps the most prized possessions of all. To wear such a jewel was to carry divine protection close to one's skin, to literally clasp beauty and holiness together. The shimmer of gold and the deep glow of cabochon rubies, sapphires, and emeralds were not just displays of wealth, they were reflections of heaven itself, a way of capturing and wearing the divine light of God. This glittering armor of faith and status was a crucial part of the medieval persona, but it was a persona largely reserved for the public eye, behind the closed doors of the bedchamber. A different, more intimate set of rituals and ideals governed the private self, a realm where the body was prepared for sleep, for prayer, and for the vulnerabilities that daylight and society did not permit to be seen. Beyond the public gaze, in the private solar of the castle, or the cramped but private chamber of a prosperous townhouse, the elaborate armor of daily dress was dismantled. The removal of these layers was not merely a practical act, but a ritual of transition, a movement from the worldly to the personal, from the performative to the vulnerable. The bedchamber was a sanctum, a place where the ideals of beauty were stripped down to their most intimate and essential forms. Here, the focus shifted from impressing a court to preparing the body and soul for the little death of sleep, a state where dreams, both divine and demonic, were thought to hold sway. The rituals performed in this space were deeply intertwined with notions of health, spirituality, and a more private kind of allure. One meant not for the crowd in the great hall, but for a spouse, for God, or simply for oneself. The bed itself was a fortress of comfort and status, often the most expensive item a family owned. For the nobility, it was a massive structure draped with heavy curtains of wool or even velvet, which could be drawn closed to create a warm, dark, and private cocoon within the drafty stone room. These curtains, or testers, did more than keep out the cold. They shielded the sleeper from prying eyes, and, in the prevailing belief of the time, from malevolent night air and spirits that roamed in the darkness. The mattress was likely a cloth sack stuffed with straw, hay, or, for the very wealthy, down feathers, and was laid over a lattice of ropes that needed regular tightening, the origin of the phrase, sleep tight. Bed linens, though not changed daily, were a mark of refinement. The feel of clean, smooth linen against the skin, scrubbed with washing bats in a stream and dried in the sun, was a sensory pleasure and a mark of household virtue. To retire to a well-made bed was to enter a place of safety and luxury, a world away from the straw pallets on the floor shared by servants and the lesser classes. The act of preparing for bed was a slow, deliberate unwinding. A lady might be undressed by her maids, her long hair meticulously brushed out. This nightly brushing was not just for tangles. It was a therapeutic and beautifying ritual. 100 strokes of the brush was a common prescription, thought to stimulate the scalp, distribute the hair's natural oils, and ensure the lustrous, shining mane so prized in the daylight hours. The hair would then often be braided to prevent tangling through the night. The plaits sometimes wrapped in strips of soft linen. For the face, the dangerous white lead and other cosmetics of the day would be washed away with mild soaps or cleansing creams made from almond oil, rosewater, and beeswax. This was a crucial act of preservation, allowing the skin to breathe and recover, however slightly, from the day's toxic adornment. Herbal infusions of chamomile or rose might be splashed on the face to soothe and soften the skin. For both men and women, the body beneath the fine robes was attended to with salves and unguents. Skin was rubbed with emollients to keep it supple, and the hands and feet, often cracked and rough from the cold, were smoothed with creams made from lard and rose oil. The nightshirt, a long, loose garment of linen or silk, was donned. This was the true medieval sleepwear, a garment of purity and simplicity. Its clean, white fabric against the skin was symbolic. It represented a shedding of the world's grime and a return to a state of innocence before sleep and prayer. It was also a garment of intimacy, seen only by one's closest family and servants. In the flickering light of a single candle, the pale face, scrubbed clean of its artificial pallor, and the body shrouded in a simple white shift, presented a different kind of beauty, one of vulnerability, repose, and quiet sanctity. This private self was also a spiritual self. Sleep was a perilous journey, and the last thoughts before slumber were considered vitally important. Prayers were recited not just as a rote habit, but as a protective measure. To fall asleep in a state of grace was to arm oneself against the temptations of nocturnal visions, which were often interpreted as messages from God or deceptions from the devil. The body prepared for rest was thus also a soul prepared for its nightly trial. The idealized beauty of the sleeping figure, as later depicted in tomb effigies, with their hands peacefully pressed in prayer, was the beauty of a soul at rest with God, a temporary respite from the struggles and sins of the waking world. It was in this hushed, shadowy realm of the bedchamber that the public performance of beauty met the private reality of the human condition, a convergence of physical care and spiritual devotion that paved the way for dreams. And in those dreams, the medieval mind found a landscape rich with meaning and symbolism, where the desires and fears suppressed by daylight, including the very nature of attraction, love, and forbidden beauty, could play out in fantastical, allegorical, and often profoundly instructive forms. As the castle slept and the embers of the hearth faded to a soft glow, the mind, unmoored from the waking world, embarked on its own journey. The medieval understanding of dreams was a complex tapestry woven from threads of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and folk belief. Dreams were not mere random neural firings. They were prophetic messages, spiritual battles, moral lessons, or diabolical temptations. And within this shadowy theater of the night, the rigid ideals of daytime beauty often transformed, becoming fluid, symbolic, and fraught with a deeper, more perilous meaning. The beautiful figures that populated these dreams were rarely just beautiful. They were emblems of virtue, vice, desire, or divine grace, their appearances serving as a direct reflection of their spiritual essence. This allegorical treatment of beauty is most vividly preserved in the literature and art of the period. Consider the ubiquitous dream vision genre, where a narrator falls asleep and is guided through a symbolic landscape by a beautiful, often radiant, figure. In the seminal Roman de la Rose, the dreamer encounters a vast garden enclosed by a high wall, a paradise of courtly love. Within it, the object of his desire is not a woman of flesh and blood, but the rose herself, a perfect, bud-like beauty protected by a formidable fortress of allegorical characters like danger, shame, and slander. Her beauty is the catalyst for the entire epic quest, but it is an abstract, idealized beauty that represents the unattainable perfection of the beloved and the complex social and emotional obstacles of courtly love. Her pallor is not from lead paint, but from the pure essence of maidenhood. Her blush is not from crushed berries, but from the virtue of modesty. Similarly, in devotional contexts, dreams and visions were the primary medium through which mortals encountered the divine. Saints, angels, and especially the Virgin Mary were consistently described in visions as possessing a beauty so radiant it was painful to behold. a light that emanated from within. The 14th century mystic, Julian of Norwich, in her revelations of divine love, does not describe Christ or the Virgin with specific human features. Instead, she speaks of a homely and courteous light, a beauty of presence and compassion that transcends physical form. This divine beauty was the ultimate antithesis of worldly attraction. It did not incite lust, but rather a profound, overwhelming love that drew the soul toward God. In the dreams of a pious individual, to see the Virgin Mary was to see a face of such serene and merciful beauty that it could heal the soul, a beauty that was the very face of grace. But the dream world had its shadows, its own dark inversions of the beauty ideal. The same culture that produced ethereal visions of the Virgin also populated the night with demons and temptresses, whose beauty was a lethal deception. A common motif in saints' lives and moral tales was the demon in disguise, appearing as a breathtakingly beautiful woman to seduce a holy hermit from his vows. This demonic beauty was perfect, alluring, and conformed to every courtly standard: the pale skin, the golden hair, the graceful form. But it was a hollow shell, a glamour designed to ensnare and damn the soul. The lesson was clear. Physical beauty, divorced from spiritual virtue, was a snare of the devil. It was a facade that could hide corruption, a lesson that resonated deeply in a society so visually oriented, yet so suspicious of the flesh. This duality played out not only in religious texts, but in the broader cultural imagination. The figure of Melusine, the fairy wife from French romance, is a poignant example. She is a creature of supernatural beauty who agrees to marry a mortal knight on the condition that he never sees her on a Saturday. For years, they live in happiness and prosperity, and her beauty is the cornerstone of their blessed existence. But when her husband, driven by jealous suspicion, breaks his vow and spies on her, he discovers her secret. On Saturdays, her lower body transforms into that of a monstrous serpent. Her perfect beauty was contingent upon a hidden, wild, and non-human truth. The revelation destroys their paradise. The story serves as a powerful allegory for the medieval anxiety about female beauty itself. It was a mysterious, powerful, and potentially unstable force that could bring greatness or ruin, and whose true nature was ultimately unknowable and uncontainable by man. Thus, in the liminal space of dreams and stories, the medieval mind grappled with the contradictions of its own ideals. Beauty was both a path to God and a trapdoor to hell. It was a symbol of inner virtue and a mask for inner sin. The same pale skin that signified nobility in the sun-drenched courtyard could, in the moonlit dream, become the unnatural pallor of a ghost or a demon. The long, flowing blonde hair that was combed with such care in the bedchamber could, in a vision, become the golden tresses of a fairy enchantress, or the unveiled glory of a saint. This dream logic did not dismantle the daytime standards of beauty, but rather deepened them, infusing them with a profound moral and spiritual weight. The body and its appearance were never just physical. They were a battleground where the fate of the soul was decided, a truth that became terrifyingly immediate in the one reality that respected no status or beauty: the ever-present shadow of pestilence and the looming dance of death. The world of courtly love and carefully constructed beauty was built upon an unstable foundation, and in the mid-14th century, that foundation shattered. The Black Death swept across Europe like a silent, invisible fire, consuming perhaps half the population. This unimaginable catastrophe did not just decimate the human landscape. It seared itself into the collective psyche, fundamentally altering the perception of the body, life, and, inevitably, beauty. The plague was the great leveler, the meticulous pallor of the noblewoman, and the sun-beaten skin of the plowman were equally susceptible to the dark, festering buboes that heralded a swift and agonizing death. In the face of such indiscriminate horror, the old ideals of courtly beauty, with their focus on leisure and artifice, suddenly seemed fragile, vain, and profoundly meaningless. This collective trauma gave rise to a new and powerful cultural force: the memento mori, the reminder of death. The phrase "et in Arcadia ego," even in Arcadia, I am here, spoken by death, would become a Renaissance motif, but its sentiment was born in the pestilential despair of the late Middle Ages. Art and literature became saturated with the macabre. The once serene and triumphant effigies on tombs were replaced by the haunting transit tomb, which featured a double representation: above, the idealized, handsome figure of the deceased in their prime, dressed in their finery; below, carved in shocking detail, the same body as a rotting corpse, eaten by worms, a skeletal grin where a rosebud mouth once was. This was not merely grotesque for its own sake. It was a brutal, stone-carved sermon. It declared that all beauty, all status, all earthly pride ended in the same putrefaction. The pale skin, so painstakingly achieved with lead or milk, was but a temporary veil over the skeleton that awaited all. This obsession with decay fostered a parallel aesthetic of piety that embraced bodily negation. If the beautiful body was so transient, then perhaps the path to true, eternal beauty lay in its deliberate rejection. The ideal of the ascetic, already present in monasticism, gained new power. Extreme thinness, once a sign of potential illness or poverty, became for some a badge of spiritual devotion. Fasting, self-flagellation, and the wearing of hair shirts were not just private penances, but public performances of a commitment to the soul over the flesh. The bodies of saints and mystics were described in hagiographies not in terms of comely proportion, but in terms of their emaciation, their pallor from vigils and lack of food, the sores from their disciplines. This was a new, inverted beauty, standard the beauty of a soul so focused on God that it had mastered and subdued the demands of the corruptible body. The light that was said to shine from the faces of these ascetics was not the reflected light of gold and silk, but an inner light forged in suffering and prayer. This shift is vividly captured in the art that followed the plague. The dance of death, a popular motif in frescoes and woodcuts, depicted skeletons gleefully leading people from every station in life: pope, emperor, merchant, beautiful maiden, knight, in a final, democratic dance toward the grave. The beautiful maiden is often shown admiring herself in a mirror, only to be tapped on the shoulder by a grinning corpse holding an hourglass. The message was inescapable. Your beauty is not only fleeting, it is a dangerous distraction from the only thing that matters, the salvation of your soul. In this context, the time spent applying cosmetics or arranging hair could be seen as a squandering of precious moments that should be devoted to prayer and repentance. Yet human nature is resilient, and the desire for beauty and social distinction did not simply vanish. It adapted. The post-plague period, with its severe labor shortages, paradoxically led to greater wealth for the surviving commoners. This new merchant class began to aggressively emulate the nobility, flaunting their wealth through clothing and adornment, which in turn triggered ever more frantic and specific sumptuary laws from the aristocracy, desperate to maintain visual superiority. The pursuit of beauty became, in some ways, more frantic, a declaration of life in the shadow of death. We see fashions becoming more extreme and elaborate: the houppelans with their impossibly long sleeves, the steeple-hennons of the Burgundian court that reached dizzying heights. It was as if society, having stared into the abyss, responded by adorning itself more spectacularly than ever. A defiant, shimmering protest against the ever-present darkness. But this defiance was now tempered by a new awareness. The memory of the plague lingered like a chill in the air, a sobering note beneath the music of courtly life, a reminder that the body was a fragile vessel, and that its earthly beauty was but a brief, fading flower. This complex interplay of defiance and despair, of lingering courtly ideals, and the stark new reality of the macabre, created a cultural tension that would ripple across the continent, manifesting in strikingly different ways from the bustling city-states of Italy to the opulent court of Burgundy. To speak of a single, monolithic, medieval beauty standard is to overlook the rich and vibrant tapestry of regional cultures that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Byzantine frontiers, while the courtly ideals of northern France and England, propagated through the songs of troubadours and the romances of Grecian de Troyes, exerted a powerful influence. They were by no means universal law. The practicalities of climate, the weight of local tradition, the influence of neighboring cultures, and the flow of trade all conspired to dye the concept of beauty in distinctly local hues. To travel from the foggy halls of London to the sun-drenched piazzas of Florence was to encounter a world where the very definition of allure could shift as dramatically as the landscape. Nowhere was the contrast with the Franco-English model more striking than in the various Italian city-states. Here, the classical past was not a forgotten relic, but a tangible presence. Its broken statues and ruined forums littering the landscape. This proximity to antiquity, combined with burgeoning mercantile wealth and a different relationship with the human body, fostered a beauty ideal that was more earthy, more colorful, and more openly celebratory of physicality. The prized pallor of the North was still admired, but it was a pallor that spoke of refinement rather than a rejection of labor. It was the shade of a lady who stayed indoors to preserve her beauty, not necessarily to prove she need not work. Italian women were far more likely to use cosmetics to enhance their features rather than to create a mask-like facade. They darkened their eyebrows and eyelashes with kohl and used a rouge called rosso on their cheeks and lips with a freedom that would have seemed brazen to a more reserved English noblewoman. The hair itself became a canvas for artistic expression. While blonde hair was still admired, there was a powerful appreciation for the dark, luxuriant tresses that were the natural inheritance of most Italian women. These were not always hidden away under veils, but were often braided with ribbons, threaded with pearls, and allowed to be seen in all their glory. The ideal face was not the long, sorrowful oval of the Gothic North, but a more rounded, heart-shaped face with a strong jaw, a fuller figure that suggested health and prosperity, and a vibrancy that seemed to draw energy from the Italian sun itself. This was a beauty that felt more human, more attainable, and more connected to the world of the senses. A clear forerunner to the radiant figures that would soon populate Renaissance art. To the north, in the Duchy of Burgundy, the courtly ideal of France was not rejected, but amplified to a level of breathtaking, almost surreal extravagance. The Burgundian court under Philip the Good and Charles the Bold became the epicenter of European fashion in the 15th century, a theater of wealth where clothing and appearance were weapons of political one-upmanship. Here, the pursuit of the tall, slender silhouette reached its apex. Men wore pointed shoes, called poulines, so long their tips had to be chained to their knees to allow walking. Their doublets were padded at the chest and shoulders, but tightly belted at the waist, creating an imposing, top-heavy V-shape. Women's gowns featured enormously full skirts and the most extreme of all headdresses, the hennin. This was a cone-shaped or truncated cone-shaped structure, often over 3 feet high, made of wire or stiffened fabric, and covered with sumptuous silks, velvets, and for the highest nobility, floating veils of sheer lawn. The hair was completely plucked from the forehead and temples to create an unnaturally high, domed brow, and then hidden away under the hennin, rendering the face a perfect, unearthly oval. This was beauty as architecture, a deliberate and costly distortion of the natural body into a walking monument to wealth and power. It was the Gothic ideal stretched to its logical and most absurd conclusion. Further east, in the Byzantine Empire, or what remained of it in its final centuries, beauty standards were frozen in a kind of magnificent amber, rooted in the rigid formalism of the Greco-Roman past and the intense spirituality of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Byzantine ideal was one of timeless, hieratic splendor. Icons were the ultimate reference point. Faces were long and narrow, noses slender and straight, mouths small and pursed, and eyes large, staring, and heavy-lidded. This was not a beauty meant to excite earthly passion, but to inspire awe and reverence. The body was consistently de-emphasized in art, hidden beneath heavy, shapeless robes of magnificent fabric, glittering with gold thread and gemstones. The beauty was in the adornment itself, the intricate cloisonné enamel, the pearls sewn in geometric patterns, the deep, jewel-toned silks. The face was a mask of serene detachment, its pallor absolute, its expression unchanging. It was a beauty that denied the flesh in the very act of adorning it, presenting the human form as a vessel for divine order and imperial majesty. Utterly removed from the fleeting trends of the West, this patchwork of ideals, the humanistic sensuality of Italy, the theatrical excess of Burgundy, the iconic rigidity of Byzantium, reveals a medieval world far more complex and diverse than often imagined. The standard was, in reality, a fluid conversation across regions, influenced by trade, marriage alliances, and war. A Venetian merchant's wife, with her kohl-rimmed eyes and uncovered dark hair, would have been seen as shockingly worldly in the court of England. A Burgundian lady in her towering hennin would have been viewed as a bizarre and fantastical creature in Constantinople. Yet, all these variations shared a common thread: the use of appearance to communicate something essential about one's place in the world, one's piety, and one's wealth. They were all dialects in the same visual language of power and identity, a language that was already beginning to evolve into something new, something that would look back beyond the Gothic spires and the Byzantine mosaics to the rediscovered ideals of the ancient world, heralding the dawn of a new age. The late medieval world, for all its entrenched hierarchies and spiritual certainties, was not a static pool, but a river, flowing inexorably toward a new horizon. The intricate codes of beauty, woven from threads of piety, status, and mortality, did not simply vanish with the turn of a calendar page. Instead, they began to unravel and reweave themselves, their strands picked up and incorporated into the vibrant new tapestry of the Renaissance. The shift was not a sudden rebellion, but a gradual transformation, a change in emphasis from the divine to the human, from the symbolic to the naturalistic, from the courtly to the classical. The Gothic spire, reaching desperately for heaven, began to be balanced by the Renaissance dome, a perfect humanist sphere that encompassed the world beneath it. One of the most profound changes was in the very perception of the human body. The medieval view, shaped by the church and the trauma of plague, saw the body as a source of sin, a temporary vessel, or a symbolic map of virtue and vice. But the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts, and more importantly, the unearthing of classical sculptures, presented a radical alternative: the body as a thing of beauty in its own right, a masterpiece of divine creation to be studied, celebrated, and perfected. The contorted, emaciated bodies of the danse macabre began to be replaced, in the artistic imagination, by the balanced, muscular, and vibrantly alive figures of Donatello and Michelangelo. The ideal was no longer the fragile, elongated Gothic form, but the solid, proportionate, and powerfully built classical form. This was a shift from denial to affirmation, from seeing the body as a prison for the soul to seeing it as its magnificent embodiment. This new philosophy, humanism, placed mankind at the center of the universe. If man was the measure of all things, then his appearance, his health, and his personal grooming were not vain distractions, but worthy pursuits. The medieval focus on the afterlife began to share space with a Renaissance curiosity about this life. We see this in the changing approach to cosmetics and care. The poisonous white lead of the Middle Ages was still used, but there was a growing interest in recipes for health and longevity. Beauty treatises began to circulate, not as collections of occult secrets, but as practical guides for the cultivated gentleman and lady. The aim was still a beautiful appearance, but the underlying rationale was shifting towards a celebration of worldly vitality and the cultivation of a pleasing persona. The artist's role transformed in tandem with this new ideal. The medieval artisan was often an anonymous craftsman fulfilling a divine commission. His work meant to direct the viewer's gaze toward God. The Renaissance artist, however, was a genius, a philosopher with a brush or chisel, studying anatomy by dissecting corpses, mastering perspective to recreate the world as the eye truly saw it, and seeking not just to represent spiritual truths, but to capture the fleeting, breathing beauty of the natural world. When Sandro Botticelli painted his Venus, she was not a flat, symbolic figure. She was a tangible being, born from the sea, her skin glowing with a warmth that needed no explanation of lead paint, her body a graceful curve of living flesh and bone. Her beauty was pagan, sensual, and immediate, a world away from the remote, clothed majesty of the Queen of Heaven. Yet, it was no less ideal. Yet, to see the Renaissance as a complete break is to misunderstand the flow of history. The medieval obsession with status and display did not disappear. It was simply expressed through a new visual language. The sumptuary laws continued, and rich fabrics and jewels were as prized as ever. The pale skin so coveted in the Middle Ages remained a sign of nobility. But now, it was often justified by references to classical poets rather than the practicalities of avoiding labor. The elaborate hairstyles of the Renaissance, braided with pearls and ribbons, were the direct heirs of the Gothic and Burgundian traditions. The legacy of the memento mori persisted, too, now taking the form of the ambiguous smile of the Mona Lisa, a reminder that joy and melancholy, life and death, are forever intertwined. The journey from the medieval to the Renaissance was thus a bridge, not a cliff. The traveler crossing it carried with them the luggage of the past, a deep-seated understanding of beauty as a language of power, a lingering anxiety about the soul, and a taste for rich adornment. But they were walking toward a new light, a world that was rediscovering the individual, the natural, and the classical. The face that emerged from the shadow of the Gothic cathedral into the clear light of the Florentine piazza was the same face, but seen through new eyes, no longer a symbolic cipher in a divine plan, but a unique, fascinating, and beautifully human mystery. And as we near the end of our long, quiet journey through these sleeping histories, it is to this face we must finally return, to gather all these threads of poison and perfume, of piety and plague, of thread and stone, and weave them into one last, soft reflection on what it all meant, and what it still whispers to us in the quiet of the night. And so, my dear sleepy listener, we have walked together through the dim, candlelit corridors of 1,000 years. We have seen the faces of lords and ladies, their skin painted with the very poison that promised perfection, their bodies sculpted by fabric and fear into living symbols of a divine hierarchy. We have breathed the air thick with wood smoke and rosewater, and we have stood in the silent bedchamber where the public armor was laid aside, and the private, vulnerable self was prepared for sleep and prayer. We have witnessed the terror of the plague that made a mockery of all earthly beauty, and the defiant, extravagant splendor that rose in its wake. We have traveled from the soaring Gothic north to the sun-warmed south, and seen how the very definition of allure could change with the landscape. And we have felt the slow, inevitable turn of the world as the medieval age, with all its contradictions, began to bend toward the light of the Renaissance. What, then, can we say was the true standard of medieval beauty? It was not one thing, but a profound and enduring paradox. It was the pale, toxic mask of ceruse that sought to mimic the purity of the lily and the innocence of the soul. It was the long, flowing hair, a symbol of virginal beauty that was often kept hidden under veils of modesty. It was the body, condemned as a vessel of sin, that was simultaneously adorned with jewels that reflected the light of heaven. It was the memento mori, the grinning skull beneath the skin, that gave a desperate, poignant intensity to every pleasure, every silken robe, and every glance in a polished metal mirror. Beauty in the Middle Ages was never just about attraction. It was a complex language spoken in the dialect of theology, social climbing, and mortal dread. To seek beauty was to navigate a narrow path between the sin of vanity and the virtue of creating a self that reflected God's order. The application of makeup was a moral act, the choice of a garment a social statement, the grooming of the body a spiritual ritual. In a world where life was, as Thomas Hobbes would later say, nasty, brutish, and short, the conscious creation of beauty was an act of meaning-making. It was a way to impose order on chaos, to signal one's place in the great chain of being, and to grasp at a sliver of immortality through the legacy of a line of poetry, a portrait in a stained glass window, or the memory of a face that captivated a court. As you lie there now, wrapped in the comforts of our modern world, these distant struggles may seem quaint, their ideals alien, but the human desires that drove them have not vanished. We still paint our faces, though our pigments are safer and our choices wider. We still sculpt our bodies with cloth and fashion, using them to signal our identity, our wealth, and our tribe. We are still captivated by the pale and the interesting, the strong and the graceful. context has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental impulse to transform the raw material of our bodies into an expression of an inner ideal remains a deeply human constant. The medieval person would understand our quest perfectly, even if they would be bewildered by our tools. And so, as this long story draws to a close, let your mind release these images of the past. Let the painted faces, the glittering jewels, the swirling scents of incense and decay, all soften and blur into a gentle, historical dream. The fears that shaped their world need not trouble your rest. The pressures they felt to conform can melt away in the safety of your night. You are here in the present, listening to a voice from the past, connected across the centuries by the simple, universal need for a story to guide you into sleep. Thank you for allowing me to be your storyteller tonight. Your presence here is what gives these whispered tales their purpose. If the journey was a comforting one, I would be so grateful if you would let me know with a like, or by subscribing to this channel for more nightly voyages into history. And if you feel so moved, I would love to hear your voice in the comments, to know from what corner of the world you are drifting off, and what time it is for you there. It is a lovely thought, a community of dreamers scattered across the globe, united in a moment of quiet peace. Now the story is told. The final candle is guttering. Let your breathing be deep and even. Let the weight of the years lift from your shoulders. There is nothing more to do, nothing to achieve, no standard to meet. There is only rest. Sleep well, my friend. May your dreams be gentle and your waking peaceful. Good night.